I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
So is this Dustbowl Danse Macabre number 3 or 4?
4.
Okay, it's 4. So this is 4. Where Spencer and I just have a conversation about something. So this go around, we won't be having a guest. And I thought maybe it would be good to kind of just situate what we think and maybe what we think about the Morin Academy's relative position in the midst of all the different things that are going on in our world right now. So is that how you kind of see what we're doing?
I am conceding your point that apparently you think people don't know what the Morin Academy's perspective would be on current events. And specifically us two. Like, we're not really speaking exactly for Jacob.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, I guess, yeah, just thinking about the Morin Academy's overall kind of message and position, I think we could kind of speak to that a little bit too.
Because you're claiming to our average listener, it is probably opaque what we would think about Minneapolis or Gaza or the breakdown of neoliberalism and the coming of whatever post-neoliberalism looks like. You think it is unclear, correct?
Well, if you put it that way, no. I think if they were thinking about it fairly hard, they could probably figure out what we were going to say. And I don't feel like we need to take a position, so to speak. I do think probably even you and I differ a little bit on the state of the world or, the importance of certain events. But as far as like what we thought the cause of all of it was and what generally would be a better solution, I think probably our followers could figure that out on their own. I think my sentiment was more along the lines of, I bet they wonder why we haven't brought it up. More than whether they could possibly figure out what our position is. Because I actually think that would be, when you put it that way, that would be fairly easy to do. But the bigger question would be, so why doesn't it come up? Because it's so dominant in the people's minds right now that the gap between our lack of saying anything directly about it and the noise of the world is there's a big gap there. And so I don't know, I thought it would be kind of interesting to talk maybe about why we don't, say so much about things like this. It wouldn't be because we're afraid to say anything about, there are many reasons why people don't talk about things, and one of them is fear, for instance, and one is just, being overwhelmed, wanting to avoid conflict. I don't know, so there are reasons why people might avoid directly referencing current events. And so I've wondered if some of our followers wondered why, more than I wondered whether they were smart enough to figure out what our position was.
So then what is your/our position of relative silence regarding current events?
Well, I mean, I can apparently only speak for myself, but I guess the reason that I have kind of come to appreciate and maybe think is also at least partly your position, is that one should not have one's mind colonized too much by the noise of the moment, because if you do, you have less ability to think, and the focus on what is going on right at the moment kind of obscures the underlying conditions and reasons why these things happen, and also doesn't necessarily produce any results. In other words, paying a lot of attention to the current moment doesn't necessarily do anything positive for the world, and deviates your attention and your activity from positive things that you could potentially do. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with all that. And then I would add, furthermore, like, my contention is that the relevance of all of these current events are occult in nature, in the sense of it is unknown what they really mean. Like, there are these deeper forces at work. There are these long-term historical trajectories, and you can't, unless you are living right there, and even then it's debatable, but unless you're living right there, it is not clear what the right takeaway is. If you just zoom in, it's just stupid in the sense of, like, brute realities that people are having to confront.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't rush in and say this is what it means. I'm clearly on the right side of history on this specific instance, because it's kind of not clear. Even if, like, the specific issue, you are on the quote unquote right side, who's to say that you're part of this wave of being on the right side?
Yeah, right, absolutely. And I think, one of the roles of political philosophy, maybe like the most important one, is simply that it tends to look at and try to discover the deep underlying reasons for things, and to evaluate things from angles that, like journalists or pundits typically don't do. And there's this gulf between, the theorist or whatever and the pundit that's so wide that they don't really, there's not a whole lot of communication that can occur between the two of them. But, and I think this is more what we do, is we deal in the realm of political philosophy, economics, theology, right? And those sources give people more of if you wanted to figure out what the deeper reasons for events were, you'd have to go to those sources to find them.
Right, but once you're really into these, there's a crushing weight to all of it, because even once you start to think at this kind of level, there's still major questions as to what are the ultimate conclusions to be drawn.
Sure, there's never a, I mean, it's a process and there's never any full conclusion, right? On the other hand, if you don't try to deal with the underlying problems, you can't possibly know how to respond or even begin to know how to fix the problem. So I think obviously, I think political philosophy is a worthy enterprise, despite the fact that we haven't figured out, how to fix the entire world. I tend to agree that with Strauss that you can't figure that out. In fact, I'm about ready to come out with another episode. I was putting it together on persecution and the art of writing. And, one of the things that he says right off the bat, more or less, is that philosophy cannot and should not try to be definitive, which is, I'm sure, a surprise to some people. But that doesn't mean that enterprise is a waste of time. And this is, I think, where we dwell more than, no one would ever mistake us for like pundits or, commentators on news events, right? But, just to give people something concrete, one thing that you might want to contemplate is maybe what we're watching is literally and this is, I'm not saying that this is necessarily true, but we could be watching the decline of the American empire, the beginning of the end of the American empire. And even then, even if we were to agree that that's true, we would then have a question of, is that good? Is that bad? Could we possibly know whether it's good or bad for the world? So that's an angle, or that's a thought that you can't get to from just being kind of horrified by the most recent events, like the Minneapolis situation, that I think is useful for helping people think clearly about the situation of the world.
What?
I don't know, just looking at your face. So what do you think? Let's go with that then. Maybe we could think about this. I believe that maybe we are looking at just typical imperial decline symptoms, like you could see in ancient Greece or Rome, or the British Empire. What do you think of that as like an image for what's happening?
Well, this is where you and I, at a theoretical level, like, I see what you're saying. I don't object exactly. I prefer to focus on the last 500 years being a constant bourgeois revolution. So I would not concede. I would concede that on one level, the British Empire has receded. On the other hand, I would say it's still incredibly powerful, even just in terms of like British nationalism. London and the finance that radiates out from there is still incredibly powerful. And I would say America has always basically been an adjunct of like the long British Empire. And you talked about the beginning of, you specifically said we might be witnessing the beginning of the end of the American Empire. And if we are somewhere along the decrepitude of the American Empire, I would really have to be convinced that this is the beginning. We can always, historically, you can always find evidence of the beginning being further back. So now, if we just calibrate the aperture of our focus onto whatever geopolitical reality you could call the American Empire, I don't think we're living through its best days in terms of health. Best days, yes, in terms of its institutional stability, not sort of like its moral health, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So I see the symptoms you're talking about. I don't and I'm not convinced that that we're at the beginning of the end. I don't know where we are. I'm not. The bigger thing is I don't feel competent to say that. I feel far more competent to say the long bourgeois empire of which America is a part will continue to exist for the foreseeable future, as long as there isn't some sort of major economic and ecological collapse.
Would you see that more or less equate that with capitalism?
Yes.
So that, like, if it shifts from America to China or something else, it's still capitalism.
Right. Capitalism as an economic reality and as a like ideological, legal reality that we call bourgeois society.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is no viable political alternative at a national and international level.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I guess to me, it's significant when the poles shift, right? But it isn't
POLE.
POLE. Yeah, when the poles shift. So, like, to go from the British Empire to the American Empire to maybe the Chinese Empire or whatever. Yes, like, very good point. That doesn't mean the end of the basic way that people think, the economy, that would remain. I mean, that's more powerful than ever. I think that's a very good point. In fact, it's so powerful that it's like basically threatening to make nation states kind of less relevant. The power of the corporate, structure is overwhelming countries to a certain extent. But for people's lives, as well as for like norms, who's in charge of empire can matter for people. And so, I would argue, the American empire has not been particularly good, right? Like on that score. Maybe no empire is, but you can definitely see the difference in norms between, say, the British Empire, the American Empire. And I bet you would see it again if you went with the Chinese, even though, yes, there's a lot of carryover. Those changes are significant simply because they affect people's lives profoundly. And this is one reason why I think, I was going to say this is one of the reasons I think that it's important to kind of think about what this means, right? Because for some people living here, I think they will maybe 50 or 100 years from now, probably less, probably like 10 or 20 years from now, they'll be asking, well, why am I even less well off than I was before? They will realize how well off they were, or, why aren't people listening? There's going to be a shift in how we live that's going to make us a little bit more like a lot of the rest of the world, I think. And Americans aren't used to that. And that right there can cause a lot of anxiety and political unrest and suffering, because they're not going to understand what has happened. But I mean,
you're framing this as meaning that if there is a decline of what you're calling the American Empire, that people's living standards within it will go down.
I think here in this country, relative to other countries, yes, could happen, because the source of our wealth is now largely, it's corporate, right? And we've already seen the erosion of our ability to like hang on to these entities. They will go wherever it makes sense for them to go. And our financial power has always been wrapped up with our military power. That's the way it always works, right? The more like powerful a country is, and the safer it is, the more likely it is to attract, to be the, business center for the world. And I think we're reaching a point where there are other places in the world that are more attractive or are more able to, like, basically attract that kind of wealth. For instance, if China looks to me like the country that's ultimately going to succeed us. I could be wrong. But, and China is not really a communist country, as you know. It's really a capitalist country, but it has more control over its people, and it has every bit of ability to, like, have no regulations and make its workforce and its environment as friendly as possible to big business. And so that's already been happening. It's been happening, since the 70s, really, that, the corporate folks have been sort of aiming in that direction because of the cheap labor, more amenable regulations and things like that. And already we're starting to feel that pain, right? And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we're having so much political unrest, is because people know, like, something's changing in their way of life. But it's going to become, I think it could become kind of gobsmackingly obvious in a few more decades, because we're currently, I do think, like, the current administration is dismantling American power at a really rapid pace. Like, if you were gonna find somebody that could, like, wreck the American empire, like, fast, you've got it with him. So, like, he's speeding the process up, I guess. I tend to think that.
Whereas I tend to think that in the long run, it's all a wash. And perhaps I'm wrong. But
Well, what do you mean by that?
I mean, this is where sort of, like, our, to the extent that I even engage in stuff like this. Well, one, I'm uncomfortable prognosticating about all this stuff because it's complicated, and suffice it to say, I don't feel super confident talking about this stuff. What I can grasp at an intuitive level, and given my commitments of being, a post-Marxist ultra-royalist, and a lot of what the kind of two extreme poles by which I view the world, I find myself agreeing a lot with what they put out with sublation media, like Douglas Lane, Cutrone, Studebaker, and their thesis, which I find persuasive enough, is that what we're seeing is, like, the renegotiation of what are the terms of what is international trade and national sovereignty going to look like as we move into post-neoliberalism. So I am not convinced that the Trump administration is necessarily destroying the empire. It is entirely possible to me this is just the rickety, scary way things look as a new political order is being built.
So, in other words, we could survive maybe the end of liberal democracy, moving into more of, like, a
I'm not even saying we'll get that
Singapore type system.
The end of liberal democracy, necessarily. Like, let's talk about this Greenland stuff. Does Trump really want Greenland, or is this just a way to renegotiate the relationship with NATO?
I wouldn't give him that much credit for strategy, but I do think it's.
This is the disagreement.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with that. I don't think he's strategic enough to be thinking about reorganizing NATO.
Well, you don't just disagree with me. You disagree with Coutron and Studebaker.
Well, I do disagree with them then. He is not a genius. Now, like, does that
Well, they're not saying that. That's a caricature of the argument. Nobody's claiming he's a genius.
Well, or even normally intelligent, right? Like, I consider him to be below average in intelligence, and I mean that very seriously. So I don't think he personally is capable of that. I don't think it takes like conscious effort for this to happen, though, right? So if part of the point is that this kind of thing is inevitable, in other words, that, it's inevitable that the European powers are going to have to fend for themselves more because we here in the United States can't afford it or don't want to deal with it, because we've overextended ourselves or we're in too much debt, both of which are true. And that, if it weren't Trump pissing them off, that sort of sped the process up by, talking about Greenland.
Very briefly, I would flag, I am not convinced necessarily we are in too much debt, just because I don't even know what debt means at this point.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, people argue about that. But and I'm not totally convinced. I mean, I'm not an economist, but it does seem like I think our national debt in conventional terms is as big as it's ever been. And that, like people have very different opinions about this, but it seems like it's from the conventional angle, it's a weakness. And our credit rating has been downgraded just a tad, believe it or not, as a country. I don't know. Like, I think part of that is actually the instability, though, that's like triggered the credit rating problem. And the strength of the dollar has declined a little bit. Anyway, like, I suspect that the Europeans and other parts of the world would begin to want to have or feel the need to have more of their own like security anyway, and take a little bit more responsibility. And America receding would have happened anyway, but it would have happened more slowly. I just really think it's the craziest thing, to see somebody just really try hard to like get rid of what it's been the source of like wealth and power for the United States for ever since World War II, the way it's dominated the world, not just Europe, but like Africa and Asia, with outposts everywhere, meddling in everybody's business. And it's expensive, right? And with the erosion,
or is it lucrative?
Well, it's both, but you have to pay according to this way of thinking, which I'm not advocating, but like you have to pay the price to reap the profits. But because America has also been kind of having to compete more with the world, especially American labor, right? Since the economy has become so globalized, the price of all that power seems more expensive because the American people as a whole are not benefiting from that power as much. The American elites are, I think, like the corporate people are, right? But the average worker is not so much as he used to. And so it doesn't seem like a very good bargain. And people don't want to pay for that if they don't feel that they're benefiting from it. But it has been the source of our wealth for decades.
The idea that it's our taxes that are paying for all this. If by definition we're going into ever increasing debt,
yeah,
it would imply that It's not the government coming to us needing our money hat in hand so that we can fund all of these foreign interventions and special operations. They just print more money and go into more debt.
They do. They do a little bit of both. I mean, obviously, if you're a middle class person, like we're all being taxed like
Right.
a lot, right?
But is the tax fundamentally deflationary and fundamentally disciplining people's households financially? Is that the real purpose of it?
Are you thinking that somebody in the Treasury Department or elsewhere is actually thinking those thoughts?
That's what all the
I don't know.
people say.
Yeah.
And
Again, they can't even figure out how to like handle the finances of the country. Like, I don't know if they're masterminds, but I haven't studied MMT. I tried a while ago, so I don't know enough about that to be able to, maybe you can say a little bit more about the theory.
well, I mean, it's just the theory is that specific countries, America first and foremost, has the quote unquote exorbitant privilege of being able to just manufacture money or print money. Printing is already an anachronistic phrase because, I don't know, it funnels through a series of bank accounts and institutions to become the money that people engage with. But the fundamental claim is that by getting off the gold and the silver standards, fiat currency, as it's called, is just a kind of arbitrary tool of the state to incentivize production behaviors. Now, I'm not saying necessarily, again, where I am uncomfortably out on a limb of these things, but what I am pretty sure of is the people running the economy, unless they are absolutely strung out on drugs and syphilis and whatever, they're thinking something more like that than some small business owner that understands that you need to make more in profits than you spend, otherwise your business is insolvent. And by extension, I would assume our politicians, again, unless they're totally crazed, understand that politics, money, power, there's a sense in which a lot of this is arbitrary. There's a sense in which this is negotiating. There's a sense in which it's all a con game because we're having to navigate the age-old philosophical question of how to reconcile the one and the many, how we reconcile at an abstract level the international abstract domination of capital with individual nation states having sovereignty and individual households and corporations within those states, finding their place in the sun.
So from that angle, taxes are a useful tool for kind of balancing the inflationary effect of printing more money.
Right, because what it is how money is taken out of circulation.
Well, it does do that. Yeah, it does do that. Whether that's an actual strategy or not, I don't know. But I mean, it's plausible, or at least it functions that way, I suppose, at least partially. Because if you don't do the one reality there, that for sure, even in MMT, it sounds like, is that if you put too much money into the system too fast, you just necessarily get inflation, and then it's not worth more, So that seems to be like a steady state principle that runs from conventional economics all the way through MMT, which is interesting.
But
right?
This is the crisis everybody's navigating, is we've all agreed. By we all, I mean the adults running the dubious institutions called nation states and their regulatory institutions have agreed our economies have to be constantly growing. Also, probably what that means is our populations should be constantly growing, whether
and they're not
manage. But they have to be constantly growing, and so what that means as well is even if GDP, like some kind of inflation, has to at least be keeping up with increased levels of production. And The ambiguity is to what extent is inflation outpacing our production? And that is the inflation that people worry about, correct?
Mhm.
But my point is, who's to say? Like, there is quite a gray zone in between whatever the real productivity is and whatever the actual rate of inflation is. And the
Sure.
politicians and economists' game is to manage this. Right?
So, well, so I was going to ask you if you thought that it occurred to me that maybe you think, and maybe this is worth thinking about, that people running the system now aren't crazier than they used to be. They're just more obviously crazy, as in we know so much more about them, right? Like one thing that I think's been revealed by the whole Epstein files situation is that an awful lot of, wealthy and powerful people in the world have always been like weird, right? Like, but normally you don't see that stuff, right? I mean, no, I don't want to go off on this necessarily, but just like a weird thought is that actually QAnon was in some ways correct. There really was like a pedophile, like conspiracy involving a lot of wealthy and powerful people. And,
You know what a conspiracy theory was about Louis XV?
no, what?
That he was abducting peasant children and bathing in their blood so that he could just prop up his diseased body.
You never know. Maybe he was, I mean, I think that one takeaway could be that because my first response to what you were saying was, well, these people really do seem to be crazy. But then it occurred to me, no, I mean, if that's one bit of evidence, like there's a good chance that the people at the very top of our economy and our politics have always been pretty weird people with bizarre tastes. And, we already know that many of them are unethical. I mean, that's been proven time and again, but like strange, crazy people. Maybe that's partly what it takes to like run things. Maybe no one else would want to. I don't know. Like, yeah. I don't know. Has that occurred to you that, or is that? I kind of figured that's kind of the way you think that like characters like I don't know run the various federal offices right now. Like I don't know Pam Bondi or RFK Jr. What's his name? The defense secretary Hegseth. That would you say that people like that are just more open about or like have less like circumspection about how they really are, or that the media has just exposed them more, but previous iterations of them would be just about as strange?
I mean, don't they say, well, one, I'm loath to not admit that everything is getting worse all the time. That is my gut level assumption as a melancholic person. But I mean, don't they say that like part of the watershed moment of the Clinton Lewinsky affair was the fact that all these journalists were, for the first time, even if in decades past people knew JFK was having lots of affairs, but there was this norm that nevertheless we shouldn't talk about it, and certainly not talk about it if it doesn't seem to be impinging upon his office.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
So, I mean, I think in large part, I mean, I don't like to I don't want to deny that people's perversions are getting more arcane or worse. On the other hand, I think the bigger revolution we've been going through is an information one where we just get to know about it.
Yeah, that's
And there's a feedback loop because once everybody knows about it, then it creates a further normalization among these people that I guess you can, have these minor to major scandals and it's all whatever. I mean, case in point, at least some of these Epstein files have been released, right? Does it
oh
does
yeah.
it matter? Or like has anyone been prosecuted after all this?
Oh, I would not want to say. I know not a lot has happened yet, beyond Epstein and his woman Ghislaine Maxwell. Um, uh, yeah, like I've heard a lot of complaints from the victims. They feel like they've been outed by this information, and that the perpetrators are being redacted, which is not a surprise, right?
It's a rudimentary lesson of how the world works. Is the poor get
Yeah.
poorer and the rich get richer. And to me, where I'm bemused is like we already knew to a large extent, like even before all the latest uproar, where now Democrats get to care about it. Like there's way too many photos of Epstein, not just with Trump, but with Clinton, with Bill Gates, with all sorts of people.
It's absolutely insane how much these people got together.
Sure. There's a whole rabbit hole. I used to listen to TrueAnon all the time. There's lots of people we've never even heard of who are in deep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you ask yourself, where do they find the time, right? Like, is that type of thing their number one activity, and all their business and political machinations are the means to get that, whatever that is that they're like trying to obtain? I mean, there's been millions and millions of documents released, and I don't even think they've released them all. So the files that what's her name couldn't fit on, or she was like, they're on my desk now, has become this, probably like a data center full of material. Yeah. And it seems to show just a tremendous amount of like social networking amongst these wealthy, famous people with this, perverse interest. And all the other people who hang on just because they're wealthy and they might get some of their money, like even if, I forget who it was, but anyway, well, Epstein for sure, but also some of his buddies, would show up at Hillary Clinton fundraisers. Why? And some of them were like Republicans, but they'd still be showing up to Hillary Clinton fundraisers because they're all kind of maybe in that same class of people where, I don't know, like they all know each other. And anyway.
And here's where I don't like to talk about it because these, like anything, I mean, how deep does it go? Is it just some of these people happen to be pedophiles and then they're just moving and shaking in this world of politics and money and guns? Is that as far as it goes? Is it, and then, to a very greater or lesser extent, an intelligence operation, and that to some extent people get blackmailed and then that's used by the CIA or Mossad or MI6 or whatever, how deep how QAnon do you want to get?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a cell in an international satanic network trying to create a one world government?
If they're trying that, they're going about it in a pretty half-assed way. So I can dismiss that one. But like, yeah, I do think it's just an interesting question to ask whether there's always been this kind of layer of perversity at the top.
Even to your objection, the even deeper question is, what if this is all a limited hangout, quote unquote? And it's really just tossed there to be one more piece of the spectacle.
Again, like
And create a pseudo
probably,
dispute, or who knows, normalize pedophilia. Normalizing cynicism about our rulers.
problem with that, or and why I tend to not go into that area, is because that's kind of what I think of as James Bond reasoning. You know how in the James Bond movies, the baddie's always like trying to figure out how to kill him in the most elaborate way possible. Instead, he could just like shoot him in the head, but no, he's gonna like trap him in a slowly descending pond of sharks. You know, that when you start feeling like the James Bond like method of assassination is happening, it's probably not true. But to me, I mean, that's why I don't dwell in that area a lot. But I am willing to wonder whether we've always had, because I wonder if like massive wealth and power just makes, it's not that pedophiles like, or, you know, perverts or whatever, like spring to these positions in order to do that, but rather that maybe those positions let loose demons in these people that would otherwise not have been, because they don't have any checks on their power, or feel like they don't. So
why wouldn't, my argument is, why wouldn't it both be? It's an environment that normalizes that, creates peer pressure to where even if you're the type of person that isn't tempted by these things, you get sucked in just on the basis of the peer pressure. And then some people do feel the pull. They are that type of person from the outset. And so they do make a series of decisions that lead in the direction they want.
Yeah, I can see that.
This all adds to the ambiguity because, I'm sure a number of people who rubbed elbows with Jeffrey Epstein probably didn't have anything to do with it. Surely, like by definition, some of these people didn't. But that just provides further cover for whatever the reality of it is.
For sure. Yeah. It seems to me like people rub elbows with folks like Jeffrey Epstein also just because they just want to enjoy some of his money, right? And, or, you know, he's got people associating with him that they'd like to associate with. But it's all, yeah, like that all provides legitimacy and so on. But, you know, I mean, in talking about this, like hopefully it's a little bit more obvious just in the conversation we've been having, which has ranged from like the, you know, are we moving into a multipolar world, or, you know, is American power receding? What does it mean? To like have our leaders always been this strange? Maybe it makes more sense to people thinking about that, why we don't spend a lot of time on these issues. I mean, tell me if I'm characterizing us rightly in your view, but I think that we're not localists because obviously, like you've just demonstrated, we pay attention to how the economy works. We do pay attention to larger economic, social, spiritual forces, but nevertheless, because of thinking about those things and kind of the overwhelming power that they exert on our lives, we spend quite a bit of time thinking about, nevertheless, like what can we do in our own lives so that we're not just simply wrapped up in this big drama that's constantly unfolding. We wouldn't exactly call ourselves localists or anarchists or whatever, you know, Benedict option people or whatever, you know, but there is a little bit of that going on in the Morin Academy in the sense that we don't want our lives to be eaten up trying to like change a massive problem that maybe is just going to have to unfold and is not going to be able to be changed by any of us.
that almost certainly will not be changed by any of us, because there are way bigger power players whose agency matters far more.
Right. Yeah. So you would agree with that basic characterization of the Morin Academy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one way to put it, and I think that's fine. I mean, I think underlying what you're talking about is just a call to radical responsibility. Like to God, to our neighbors, to ourselves, to do what we can, and to ascertain what is right and just, and to do it to the extent we are capable, which inherently pushes you. I mean, there's a contradiction that the Morin is primarily online, and so there's a sense in which at an intellectual argument level, we're making an argument for what appears to be localist action. But where localists wouldn't, I think fundamentally where we turn them off is what's implicit in everything we're saying is that there's no such thing as a pure local environment anymore.
Right.
Because we're living in this post-global situation where everything you try and do locally is already predicated upon a globalization of everything, and everything you also do is very fragile and vulnerable, because depending on what happens at global levels, everything you're doing can get wiped out with a greater or lesser degree of drama. So put simply, if somebody took away from this argument that, or the Morin Academy thesis that they should start a farm, I think that's one thing you could take away from what we're arguing. We're saying, yes, people should go and start farms. But a tornado is quite possibly going to swing by and totally wreck your farm.
Right, right. Yeah, part of what we're saying is you need to know what you're getting into for real, right? Like, I think that's one of the values of studying some of these larger forces, even though you can't ultimately change them, is that if you do want to be at all effective in the world, you can't spend most of your life dreaming that it were otherwise. So you do have to understand the headwinds that you're against. And if you could understand them a little bit better, you might be a little bit better able to overcome them, maybe, but at least you will be more informed. Yeah. Yeah. But at least you're more informed. I mean, it's, there are people who go into these things seemingly very naively, right? And just sort of expect things to work out, and then are pretty surprised when they don't. And that's, I don't want that to happen. I don't think it's good when people are encouraged kind of naively to do those things. And that is one thing that localists edge up on sometimes, is that kind of like sepia toned vision of kind of reclaiming local community and rural life and things like that, that we can sort of like hive ourselves off in some ville somewhere and, then kind of have it our way. But you can't. You can't hive yourself off. And so to a certain extent, trying to do that is just avoiding reality. Why would you want to do that with your life?
And because psychological parameters are, it can be more pleasurable.
Right. Kind of like doing drugs or whatever. But yeah, but it's a form of avoidance in a way.
Sure.
Whereas I think
but we're all to a greater or lesser extent avoiding realities that either definitely are or at least could be. And so we all need our binkies. And for some people, it takes to my mind, perverted form of like reading French Porch Republic and trying to, have a boutique business on Main Street.
hopefully our FPR people aren't listening right now. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, this is why we don't dwell on Front Porch Republic, is because there is quite a bit of like wishful thinking. It's it's admirable in the sense that I think a lot of people, at least intellectually, kind of know know better what's sort of wrong with our world, and they have decent values, but they kind of do dwell also in that ideal space, right? And everything will work out if it's just an ideal, and you're not
Right.
actually trying it, but if you try it.
Right. As long as these can be sort of the fantasies of privileged people with sinecures, you know,
Right.
it's a way for them to console themselves. It's fine. There's even a kind of beauty to it, but it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
a practical
right.
program which could become universalized. Or if it can become universalized, it would be because of a massive effort at some sort of global or at least like regional communitarian revolution.
Hmm.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
my
Nothing.
experience with actually existing humanity says is not in the cards.
No, no. I mean, one of the things that I've kind of taken away from just the past few years and the protests, and even the ones in Minnesota, I think will go this way, is people will, I mean, even if you look at the history of other societies where people have like staged massive protests, with the Soviet Union and China being major exceptions, I think. But like for the most part, as soon as the problem goes away, people go back to their way they were before.
Slash, I would say, as
Only,
a chronic expression of the problem appears to go away.
yes, that's right, appears to go away. Right. So I imagine that if, for instance, the
Or,
current
sorry, not chronic. I mean,
administration,
an acute expression of a chronic problem.
mhm, yeah, I knew what you meant. Yeah. But yeah, like if they retreated and let's say that they were like, oh, yes, we're going to totally change things. Um, I think that everybody would just go back to the way that they were before. Whereas what you would love to have happen is people find out that there's something more important than, their individual private interests, right? Their jobs, their property, their like all the stuff, that there's something even more important than that involves like maintaining those ties and deepening them. And I guess the way I've thought of the Morin Academy's philosophy or whatever is that we are trying to talk more about what it takes to actually build and maintain relationships with other people and with the land. And though to actually do that is really hard. So we never do come to like conclusions about here's the recipe, here's the way that you do it. But to the extent that people can do that, we wouldn't even have the problems that are developing at an acute level in Minneapolis right now to begin with, right? Like if we didn't think the way we normally think and we thought more about our fellow human beings and we thought more about God and what God wants and we understood God well enough, we wouldn't have these problems. So I think this is the way I see, what the hard conversations we have, right, are about trying to find out what that's really like. And in our current environment, I mean, I'm sure it never was easy, but to be responsible for the land or to be responsible for your fellow human beings and have cooperative relationships with them is like extremely difficult. So we talk about that, not because we want to be downers, but because that's the truth, right? So again, like unless you know something closer to the truth of the matter, how could you possibly do anything but sort of exist in that, I would call it, like you front porch file magazine, mentality of, I'll just sit down and read about this and it'll, I'm going to feel good. Right. That's,
which is fine as long as it's presenting to you, like enter this world and gain inspiration on how to do a bunch of localist stuff. But then what it is as a commodity is another periodical that you can consume.
right. And the only way that you probably would know if there's a sign that you're actually getting told the truth about matters and that you might be getting some information that you could actually use to move off your couch would be if the information was kind of abrasive. If you didn't get that feeling.
But then if the content were abrasive, then they're tanking their market.
Right.
Just where,
but since we're not we're not worried about our market. So we can be abrasive. You're right. I mean, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Remember that next time you're mad at me for being abrasive. But yes, and it's just another example of how if we treat them as these small outfits that would like to be making a change in the world, how when you're living in this post-global situation, everything is vexed. And all of your incentives will be to sort of, what do you have to do to make the minimum viable product to fly?
Right.
And if you don't care about that, then what is your funding source to allow you to be so cavalier?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Market imperatives. Yeah. Those are harder to overcome than assholes, right? Like, I think that I was just talking to a class yesterday about this, just trying to explain like that dynamic. And because people want to moralize, right? They want to say, oh, it's just assholes getting in our way. But it's definitely not just assholes. They do exist, though.
Right. Well, and this is where, I mean, this is one of the things I make sure to like represent is like, I think there is a lot to be said for the Marxist critique of petite bourgeois radicalism. Mm-hmm. And almost everyone I encounter that imagines that they're either a liberal or especially the leftists, it's like, do you understand Marx spent his whole career critiquing people like you, naive suckers like you, and maybe he was wrong, but they don't even know that.
Right.
So that's another, I would argue, like strut of what I'm putting forward is that strive for a French porch republic. That's all well and good, but understand that you will encounter major resistance.
Right. Yeah. I do think most of our followers probably understand all of us as not thinking, even, I think I can speak characterizing Jacob, that radical liberalism is not only not what we're about, but also what we've fairly consistently critiqued as not nearly good enough. It oftentimes is well-intentioned, in the sense that people who embrace it, they want people to be treated well. They want people to have their rights. They care about things, but it doesn't fundamentally challenge the status quo. Although it certainly has riled up like right wingers at the moment who have their own version of it, right? I mean, their own like radical reaction to it, but all that PC stuff hasn't made the world a better place, has it?
Infantile disorder. It's predicated on the idea that the government is just sitting on billions of dollars, and if they and the corporations would just share it, then the potential of the billions of dollars of creativity and resources and love and compassion that all the people have in their reservoirs, and they're just frustrated because they live in this world of chains. If they could just be truly invested in and freed up to reveal their beautiful potential,
Mm-hmm.
then we'd all be living lucrative, comfortable lives.
Right.
And that can be sustained at a kind of emotive level. And then it's like, try doing anything.
Right.
People that
And
most firmly believe it are like problem number one.
well, they totally, their function seems to be to just kind of diffuse frustration, right? Like you see that there's a problem and you're kind of willing to vent about it, right? And to say, if only this just get out of our way, or get, then um and and so in that mode, the person can't really ask themselves, well, what what am I doing? Like, what would I do, right? If I could, is there a step I can take? Like, for instance, um if you are like upset with the fact that homeless people exists, are there very many people like the folks that we talked to from Portland, Bert and Emma, letting homeless people into their home or making a place for them in their backyard? Okay, so I mean, this is kind of to tie in the Catholic worker stuff that we talk about. Those folks do those types of things that other people, and I think a lot of liberals, would think was absolutely crazy and dangerous and just like would never consider, right? But yet they are done. So that's why the Catholic worker movement, I think, is interesting to us. Is it may not, no movement can go all the way and do everything it wants to do. But a lot of these folks are kind of taking matters into their own hands and oftentimes paying a significant price because of the headwinds we're talking about. Like, everything is not rosy for Bert and Emma, right? Like, they have to constantly contend, and you guys at the JP2 farm have to constantly contend with a lot of headwinds because there's nothing in this society that rewards that type of behavior.
Mm-hmm. It's only punished at basically every level.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you just do easy, straightforward charity. But
Right.
I mean, to
So
me,
radical liberals are capitalists with kind of an emotional safety valve. But anyway, go ahead.
right, and their social function. I mean, I'm very convinced of the right wing conspiracy thesis that these people are just shock troops of oligarchs. That
They certainly serve that function.
objectively, that's all they do. Right, and they waste people's time. They get people hurt. They rile up people with too much expectations of what's possible, and then bring them crashing down. But again, that's part of their shock troops of capital function. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's as simple. I recently learned that the Latin root for the word nice, like now, nice means sort of like pleasant and kind, but the Latin root means ignorant. And I think where that's very revealing is when nice people think that somewhere else mean people should be nice to other people. Chances are very good that they are just ignorant of the situation. Like,
For sure.
and I don't just mean that in terms of, why can't the Israelis just be nice, or vice versa? Why can't the Palestinians be nice to the Israelis? But I mean, it's baked into our contempt historically for Catholicism, I think, or in like the Middle Ages, antiquity period, like when it's like people have this narrative that the Inquisition was horrific. Meanwhile, the Obama administration killed more people in Pakistan with drones in 8 years than the Inquisition killed in 200 years. For whatever reason, at least, non-thinking people would assume that the Obama administration has legit reasons for bombing people. But somehow or other, we just assume, we more than just assume, we sort of take for granted the presupposition of the following assumption, that, the Inquisition must have just been totally deranged and crazy and couldn't have like a functional reason of like creating a proto modern national state.
Mm-hmm.
But it's predicated on niceness in the classical sense. Didn't these Catholics just know they didn't have to kill Jews?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, one difference between those two is just that one is much more blatantly like honest about what it's doing than the other, right? Like, I think the modern liberal mind kind of wants everything to be papered over, so they don't have to actually look at it.
It's a species of rationalism.
Right. Yeah. But what you do find, and I mean, I don't speak about this very often, but I have I have many stories to tell about like mean-spirited liberals that on the surface held all the right views, but were perfectly capable of going after somebody's career or trying to ruin their life, or a little less dramatic, just being extremely unpleasant on a personal basis. You go into something and you're trying to accomplish something, but they quickly try to domineer the group and insult people who don't agree with them. So I mean, obviously, it was obvious to me that there's a difference between saying and doing with a lot of those people. But I mean, that's of course,
and it makes you. I mean, I've drawn my conclusion from this, but it makes you wonder, are such creatures actually capable of the sort of universal love for humanity that they profess? Or is it in fact one more layer of their sadomasochism and their narcissism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, my experience has been that no, honestly, they're probably less capable of it. And I mean, this is, again, there's so many reasons why we're here at this point, but what did you say?
More capable of universal love for humanity, impartially delivered, or the narcissism and masochism?
I still missed part of your question.
Sorry, go ahead. I think you implicitly, by the way you're talking, you revealed it.
Okay. Yeah, I guess, yeah. My experience has been that that a lot of times they would be less capable of doing that because they're less capable, in my experience, of actually seeing the person, right? I mean, they see, like, when they go into a project, they see the ideas that they think ought to be carried out, and so they measure the persons around them on the basis of how well those persons correspond and fit their ideals. And if you don't, which you inevitably won't, like perfectly match up with those because they really exist in their perfection only in their minds, then they're going to end up being mean to you. They can become quite domineering. So, I mean, again, I think where I left off was there's a reason. This is among the reasons why we have this right-wing backlash, for sure. And I'm not far from the first person to say this. I think it's a rather extreme backlash that just shows that the other side is just as dumb as they are. But like, their nature was kind of designed to bring this type of anger out in people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Inevitable. But this is the difference of thinking that there's some straightforward way you can just walk into a situation and impact it in the ways you want, versus what they actually do, which is undermine their argument and undermine the world they want to create.
Right. And then they go off and blame other people for having stopped them so they can just relax because they've tried. Yeah, it's frustrating.
But the charitable read is, as they're like everybody else, their sense of how things should be is radically at variance with how things are. And so where do you want, if you cannot accept that reality, then what layer of the stages of grief do you want to stay at? You can bargain, you can be angry, you can be depressed, whatever the other one is. Denial. You can be in denial. And usually people are existing at multiple levels of that in multiple ways.
Oh, for sure. And to a certain extent, you have to, right? Just to be able to live in the world and not go nuts. But there should be a balance. If you're going to be a fully, responsible person or try to be free, there needs to be a balance where you're not always living in your fantasy.
Well, and I think part of, if we're making an argument for radical responsibility and radical intellectual honesty, then what that means in part is like striving towards acceptance. And part of the feedback you will constantly get, let's say you achieve acceptance about the inevitability of ICE or the inevitability of, some sort of genocide and redevelopment of Gaza, or the shakeup of neoliberalism into whatever's coming. Let's say you really have accepted that reality and you're trying to live responsibly in the light of that reality. If people have also not achieved that level of acceptance, then they can just misinterpret that acceptance as one of the other stages. So acceptance to an angry person or a person in denial will look like despair.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or just, approval. Even it can it also look like approval, like, oh, you don't mind it.
Right. And that's why, adulting is accepting that we live in a world of false necessities. And part of what being able to accept that means is that there are these illegitimate things that are nevertheless real and have to be, like the Furies have to have their sacrifice. And then there are people that love the necessity and they want to pretend that it's not false, that in fact it's true and we should celebrate it. Or vice versa, people that think because the necessity is false, it is not a necessity and it can just be wiped away with no consequences or struggle or virtue on their part.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't think like that, you are part of the problem.
Correct. Right. And it's in very few people's interest to explain to people why necessities can be false.
Right.
Because we're back at the abrasiveness that turns people off. Because,
right, well,
as Adorno said, in the absence of class politics, all you can have are gangs and rackets. And so all we can do, if we can't fully strive for the common good, then all we can do is try and create cults. That's adulting, I'm told.
The best professors I had were the professors that made people cry. I had one in particular. I didn't cry.
Would they say that?
He scared me, but I didn't cry. But this guy would make people cry, from going into his office because he would tell them that their paper sucked and was completely unacceptable, for instance, and belittle it just for good measure. Of course, this was grad students, so he could get away with that. Also, it was a different time when people weren't quite as sensitive. But I thank the fact that I had that guy as a professor. He taught me a lot because he was deadly serious about what he was trying to do and what he was demanding of his students. And yes, he was incredibly abrasive and people avoided him. But he was one of the best professors I had. So I tend to think this is kind of the space that we occupy quite a bit of the time. We also are just not motivated by gaining ever increasing numbers of people. We want to find people who really, really want to learn, interact, hopefully, but at least learn and stick with these ideas even when they're not easy.
Do you
No.
feel like we have sufficiently addressed I thought we would be getting more into Minneapolis, Gaza.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we've done better than that. I mean, um, the only point I was going to make on Minneapolis is it is kind of nice to see. I think one thing has happened with some significance is that those people moved from the type of protests where people are just kind of having fun to actually doing something closer to what people during the civil rights movement did, which is risking their lives to obtain some goal. Now, we can argue about the goal or like what the real significance of it is. I don't think we probably would argue that it's probably a bad idea for ICE to be all over Minneapolis and like basically terrorizing people with their big guns. But like, I do think that that's a different, something we haven't really seen. And it's been done without them committing violence. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of the civil rights strategy in that regard too. And I actually respect that. I don't really jive too much with the other kind of protest. And I don't think that it really gets much of an effect. But when you basically just won't, you just sort of like people just refuse to stop, even if they're in harm's way, that's usually when they can at least get some attention. So I got to give them some credit for that. They have a lot of people display courage when they think that their way of life is seriously under threat. And I guess the Minneapolis people think it is, right? And so there's a lot of reasons why this is happening, but I'll just say like that's a different type of behavior, and I do kind of respect that. I think Alex Peretti, the guy that like jumped in there to try to help a woman who'd gotten shoved really hard by this big guy with a gun, was acting like a man, and the fact that he had a gun in his pants should have been of no, is just a totally bogus lie about what he was trying to do there. So I do think of that man as kind of a hero. I think that he tried to do the right thing and he was willing to put himself in harm's way for what he believed was right and for the safety of that woman. And that's admirable. If more people had instincts like that, especially men, like I think the world would be a better place. So, I mean, to that extent,
Especially if they did it proactively when it isn't as obvious as somebody shoving a woman.
Exactly. Yes. Right. And then, yeah, that gets back to like, you have to work on before these things happen, fostering real, solid, caring human relationships. And that's probably where Minneapolis, maybe they do. I think they probably do better than some of the country because they seem to have more of a culture there, but probably not enough. I think probably they would slip back into normalcy if things were good enough. But yeah, like I would like more people to be like that all the time. Have some courage, kind of like disregard your physical comfort to a certain extent, instinctually try to do the right thing. Yeah.
Sure. Right. And the issue is it's this paradox that people, at least some people, are more able to do this when things are really bad, and they struggle to do it when things are a lot, quote unquote, better.
Yeah.
Because the situation doesn't seem to be called, again, it's one thing, they're standing up for Somalians now. Had they done it when rent was being raised on these people?
Right. And maybe a few of them did, but nobody got up in arms enough to actually do something about that, right? Or to potentially solve the problem themselves. Yeah.
Correct. Right. And granted, in their defense, it's all complicated. They would encounter a million mundane, stupid, bureaucratic issues.
Hmm.
That's why it's a lot more sexy to do it when there's dudes in military fatigues with machine guns trying to do something.
Right. When it seems like a crisis. I mean, you see this all the time with people. Like the very best comes out in people during times of extreme crisis. They'll forget about their partisan bullshit. They'll get into boats to rescue their neighbors. Guys who are usually sitting on the couch watching the Super Bowl are out there like dragging people off the roof when the flood comes in. And that's all like beautiful. It shows you what people are capable of. But then the rest of the time they're sitting on the couch watching a football game.
Right, which is the issue with the kind of like radlit anarchist take that would want to say, look what people can do in these extreme situations. Now imagine if these same people rebuilt society.
Yeah, imagine it.
If they can do extreme things, why can't they do stuff like this all the time? And the answer is because people lack the virtue and the intellectual clarity and the trust to work with other people to pull this off. And then we fall back on bureaucracies and markets and our domination by sociopaths. And then we wonder why we end up in the crises that we're in.
Yeah, exactly. We need to foster habits, even if slowly and incrementally, foster habits of actually engaging on a regular basis with our fellow human beings and trying to be, this is a term that Brueggemann uses, so it's not totally bogus, but neighborly, right? Like neighborliness is underrated. It's what creates strong communities that solve problems before they become acute. And yeah.
So the problem is once you're in an acute situation, the neighborliness is insufficient to resolve the acute problem quickly, is why it seems so lame and pathetic.
Yeah. Right. Then it seems completely inadequate. But
in those terms.
Yeah. But it's also what, if you have it, it supports a value system that stops people from going off the rails and causes people to think about their fellow human beings ahead of time so that these problems don't happen as often. And so the fact that we're not fostering them and we're not working on that as Christians, as Americans, is making it more likely that we'll continue to keep having these social and political breakdowns, these crises.
Right. And for people that cannot accept that, then they have to decide, will I be in denial? Will I bargain? Will I be angry? Will I be depressed? Because they can't accept that these crises are inevitable based on the false necessities that we live our lives on and that we are complicit in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The consciousness of your guilt is a hard thing for folks to handle. It's hard for anybody to handle. And I think, one recommendation I can make to folks is the more honest you can be with yourself, the better. It's really not that bad. You just have to get used to it,
And part of it is the truth that people want to jump to these conclusions that are not warranted. Like I can, my life can be in all sorts of ways benefited from what ICE is doing, even if in a lot of ways that's objectively bad activities. That doesn't mean it's all my fault, or like if I just myself, the problem is resolved. Like these things, the guilt is diffused.
Mm-hmm.
And so partly it's having the intellectual maturity to realize that I can be guilty and so can hundreds of millions of other people. And therefore I shouldn't feel like it's all my fault.
Right. Yeah.
It'd be pretty odd, but.
Mm-hmm. But yet it's not to folks. And there's a real strong tendency in our world to avoid the feeling of guilt at all anyway. So when people feel some of it, it can feel crushing, right? Like that's why Catholics and Lutherans, they joke about a Catholic guilt or Lutheran guilt. That's why those jokes
It's
exist.
harder to have left liberal guilt because it's an inherently nihilistic worldview. So how can you be guilty? There's no confession. That's my point.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Priest to go to relieve, except I guess it's protest to atone.
Well, there's no guilt. I mean, they avoid it entirely by their sense of righteousness, right? So it's your fault. You or somebody stands in their way, right? And they are absolved.
Right. We're back at the nice ignorant connection.
Right.
I will deny my complicity in this situation, and I will overplay other people. I will oversimplify the situation. What's happening in Minneapolis and in Gaza is just because there aren't people as nice as me.
Right, yeah. The alternative is to feel a little bit dirty, right? Soiled or whatever you want to call it, right? Like, because you're also going to realize as soon as you admit that you do benefit and are very much enmeshed in these things, you're going to, if you're rational, you're going to wonder what's going to happen to you if these things actually did get fixed.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you might not actually want some of those things to happen, and then you have mixed feelings, and then you feel gross, right? All of that happens, but that's like being a human being, that feeling,
Right. But most people would rather be subhuman. They would rather just put on their beaky and live in fairy tales.
Right. Yeah, there's this desire to be kind of perfect, but I mean the big Christian message of even at the very beginning, right? The whole creation story is we are imperfect, sinful beings in need of God's grace, and without God, we can.
Our potential to heal and grow together is infinite.
And only with, yeah.
Right, which I would argue, part of what I didn't realize this is what we were signing up for, but I would argue the real significance of what we're doing is just crypto apologetics. The real solution to all this is developing a genuine piety, learning about and trying to realize the social kingship of Christ. And most of these problems get resolved. But that's a path of intellectual growth and repentance and asceticism that, again, is hard to commodify. And therefore, it's not pushed in society.
Oftentimes, like liberals and leftists will look at the Christian solution or the Christian perspective as naive. But after talking about all of the obstacles and the major forces that are up against us as we, think about trying to change the world for the better, I think the Christian perspective should look very rational indeed, right? The idea that you need to have a higher power, that you need the help of God, that we cannot solve these problems on our own. It should look fairly reasonable. I know it doesn't to them, but yeah, I'm basically speaking of the reasonableness of Christianity.
Right, and it's not because the Catholic thesis is that sin darkens the intellect, and the reason why it's not obvious, if you swallow this big pill, what you ultimately have to let go, you have to embrace poverty, and not just like material poverty, like Catholic workers are good at emphasizing, but like letting go of all of your, I mean, at least if you take it to the end, You're talking about crucifying your passions, your wants, your lust for material wealth and political power in a straightforward way. And there's a sense in which, in the long run, you actually get these things back purified. But I don't know, it's a basic Christian tenet, right? People love darkness instead of light. They love the world instead of God. And then we wonder why we reap the whirlwind.